Minasan, konnichiwa. Is everybody still awake and with me? I appreciate that today is a long day of a lot of dense topics, so I'm going to try and keep this as interesting and as engaging as possible. Before I begin, I would like to extend my thanks to Rotary International, to the Rotary Foundation, to the ICU Rotary Peace Centre, and to all of the host councillors that have really welcomed us to Japan and made sure that this experience has been not only valuable professionally, but very, very much so personally. I think that's one of the things that sometimes we miss when we talk about the Rotary Peace Fellowship. It's not just something that is able to enrich us on a professional level, but actually one of the biggest things that we gain is a really, really rich personal experience. And I know I very much valued my 2 years here in Japan, and I'm leaving a little bit reluctantly. I really do love my life here in Japan. Okay, so before we get started, when I came here, I wanted to think about what is peace? What does peace mean to me, and what does peace mean to us? And one of the things that I realized that peace is not just the absence of violence. Quite often we characterize places that don't have violent conflict as being peaceful. However, that's not necessarily true, and conflict does continue to exist in places even after war and violence has technically ended. And so when I was planning my research for my applied field experience last year, I really tried to think about how I could consider this in my research. So I was interested in continuing my work with the vulnerable and the marginalized. I knew I wanted to return to South Asia, where I'd worked before. And I also wanted to explore what this post-war scenario would look like. And so that very naturally led me to researching in Sri Lanka. Now, as many of you know, Sri Lanka experienced a very long civil war that spanned almost 3 decades. And that was a war between the Sri Lankan state and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, commonly referred to as the Tamil Tigers or the LTTE. I'll be referring to them as the LTTE today. They were defeated by the Sri Lankan government, led by President Rajapaksa in 2009, in May 2009. So that was almost 6 years ago. So I went into Sri Lanka after 5 years of the end of the conflict. And I knew that when I reached Sri Lanka, that conflict was something that was still being experienced, particularly by people that had been sympathetic or involved with the LTTE. So this meant vulnerable minorities in Sri Lanka were still being very, very much targeted. And I knew that their daily life had not improved, but I didn't know how. So this is what I decided to go and spend my time in Sri Lanka researching. So as Caitlin shared, I worked with 2 organizations. One was a human rights organization called Inform. Now Inform had a very, very negative relationship with the Sri Lankan state. So Inform was a group that was monitored very heavily. Inform was an organization, and still is, that has its staff followed by police cars. The phones are tapped, the emails are monitored, and the state is very, very suspicious of anything that Inform does as an organization. The other organization that I worked with was Sri Lanka Unites. Now, Sri Lanka Unites is a youth movement, and Sri Lanka Unites very carefully positioned themselves to have a very, very positive relationship with the Sri Lankan state, which made them very, very unique as an NGO, because NGOs in Sri Lanka very seldom had a very positive relationship with the Sri Lankan state, as they were very, very skeptical of any NGOs. And actually, during the war, President Rajapaksa ejected all NGOs, so the Red Cross, the UN, any UN agencies, human rights organizations, they were all banned from working during that time. So that's a brief background of the conflict and the situation that I was entering. During my research, I conducted workshops with various groups across Sri Lanka, particularly groups in the north and the east where the war had been particularly violent and destructive, and where there was actually still a very heavy military presence in Sri Lanka. I found there repression of dissent, enforced political disappearances, attacks against women, a large number of war widows, restrictions on religious practices, and military interference into daily life. And that interference into daily life was something that I personally experienced as well, even in my time working there, even though it was nowhere near to the level of the communities that were living their full lives in these areas in Sri Lanka. So my research, when I came back to ICU, I wanted to make sure that my research was led by what I had found in Sri Lanka, not by my own assumptions that I had left when I went there. So I came back and I looked at my data, and I found that there was very definitely a link between dehumanization and the process of securitization. And so today I want to just explore this connection with you through the case study of Sri Lanka. So first up, you can't talk about something like dehumanization without considering, well, what does it really mean to be human? You know, we all exist, we eat, we sleep, we go to the bathroom. That's what happens. But what more can we characterize being a human as? So the dictionary definition refers to being a human as distinguishable from other animals by superior mental development, the power of articulate speech, and upright stance. And I'm really hoping that I can keep you guys in that realm by the end of this presentation. But really, if somebody asked you, what makes you you? What makes you the person that you are? It's something that we construct ourselves. It's something that we construct socially. It's not something that's always a given. And that really comes down to identity. Now, what makes up our identity? I'm sure if I asked even 3 people in this room, everybody would say something completely different. Especially the first thing that people say is usually something that's quite telling. But these can be things like our religion, our preferences, our politics, nationality, sexuality, race, gender, ethnicity, family ties. And all of these things are, like I said, they're socially constructed, and they're something that we all hold dear. Next up, I wanted to just kind of look a little bit at what security means. Now, security is something that, we all kind of have a general idea of what it means, but I think sometimes when we look really specifically, we're not always entirely sure. But really, it's the freedom from danger and threat. And that is the real thing that's probably that's most pertinent from this formal definition of security. What I really looked at during my research was this process of securitization. Now, securitization is the social process through which people and situations are subjected to politicization to meet the goal of security. So to meet the goal of security, we pick different aspects of daily life and we securitize them. So one of the things that we're very, very used to is the securitization around anti-terror. So we want to be secure from terrorist threats. So we do things like we go through scanners at the airport. We're really happy to subject ourselves to, we're really happy to sign off on longer detentions. And there are a number of different things that exist in our daily lives, particularly as people that travel, that are related to anti-terror processes. Now, I just want to say here very quickly that while securitization can be both a positive and a negative thing, I really focused on how securitization can work to be negative on a particular community. So, next up, who provides security and who is it for? So really, I would say, well, security is for me as a citizen of the world. I want to feel safe. I want my family and friends to feel safe. And who's responsible for that? Well, really, the government's responsible for that. But within the system that within which we live, the nation state is the recipient of security, and that's the referent object that we really focus our security processes on, not the individual. So what happens when human identity is securitized? So what happens when we target particular communities to extra processes that other people are not subjected to under the guise of providing security? Does anybody recognize where this might be from? This is a picture of women queuing up at a checkpoint This is Palestinian women queuing up at a checkpoint, and these are IDF soldiers manning the checkpoint. So this is an ethno-religious conflict that we might be very, very familiar with. These are images from another ethno-religious conflict that we might be really familiar with. These are images from the recent crisis of the Rohingya fleeing Myanmar following the process of being made stateless. And shortly my colleague Sana is going to talk a little bit more about this particular case study. Here we see people in Sri Lanka. These are Tamil people in Sri Lanka in 2010. Under heavy restrictions in a camp following the end of the war. So this is after the war had ended. People were still living in camps, people were still not able to move freely, and people were still in a position where they were not able to live their daily lives as they chose, with dignity like other citizens in Sri Lanka, based on the premise of their identity, based on their ethno-religious identity. So, while Anna did a really, really great job of talking to us about dehumanization and delegitimization, my study focused on dehumanization as a process of oppression. And this is really characterized by Paulo Freire's take on dehumanization. And this looks at unjust or cruel exercise of authority and power, especially by the impositions of burdens. The condition of being weighed down, the act of pressing down, a sense of heaviness or obstruction in the body and the mind. I experienced this in Sri Lanka through the repression of dissent. I was working with activists that were not allowed to speak out, and when they did speak out, they were at risk of being taken by the military for fear of being terrorists. So the Sri Lankan state, following the end of the war, was very, very paranoid about a resurgence of the LTTE and wanted to make sure that the Tamil minority very much stayed a minority and did not gain any political power because it would challenge their construct of what being Sri Lankan really is. So, who is subjected to dehumanization? In these cases, we saw that ethno-religious minorities are subjected to it, women are big victims of dehumanization, children, and groups with little or no political power. I want to talk to you guys a little bit about one particular case, one of many that I experienced while I was in Sri Lanka. Now, this woman is Jayakumari Belendran. Jayakumari Belendran was arrested very publicly last year. She had been actively campaigning against political disappearances, and she had been speaking very directly with the UN, and she had been present at a protest when the UN was in Sri Lanka investigating whether they should be looking into the war crimes of the state. So Jayakumari was a direct threat to the Sri Lankan state, as she was somebody that was speaking out against their actions. Jayakumari is a war widow. She's a Tamil woman, she's the mother of a disappeared person, she's been displaced, and she's an activist. So there are a number of aspects of Jayakumari's identity that were securitized when the Sri Lankan state decided to pick her up and detain her for almost a year. She was actually only released when the government changed earlier this year during the electoral shift. And fundamentally, she didn't fit in. She was not singular, nor was she Buddhist. And she spoke out against crimes that the Sri Lankan state did not want to come to light. So all of the aspects of her identity were something that was subject to securitization, and she was detained as a result of the Prevention of Terrorism Act in Sri Lanka. Fundamentally, my research question was, how does the process of securitization enable the dehumanization of vulnerable communities in post-war Sri Lanka? And I found that this was the case through the repressive control of women, the military occupation of minority areas, enforced disappearances, displacement of communities, and interference of daily life. This all contributed to the systematic dehumanization of vulnerable minorities in Sri Lanka. I really hope that this has given you an insight into the case study of Sri Lanka and what dehumanization and oppression can look like even after the end of violent conflict. I'm really open to questions now, so thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Nikki. That was fantastic. It seems like we have a question here. Is there a microphone on that side? Or thank you so much.
You were just mentioning the situation after the government changed very recently. Could you could you explain a little more of your findings? Or have you noticed any substantial changes after the government have changed? Because the new president, as I understand it, was supported by the Tamil minority for lack of a better option, I presume.
Yeah, I think.
And how things have perceptively changed, I guess, is the question.
So I've been really interested to see how daily life in Sri Lanka has changed since that change in government on the 8th of January 2015. And in some ways there's been some very positive shifts, and in other ways I think it's going to be a really long time before we see a real process of reconciliation starting. So while some of the military processes have changed, so people are not persecuted as heavily, and the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, is not being enforced as heavily, we're still seeing that in Sri Lanka it's going to take some time before this government is politically in a strong enough position to be able to make some very tangible changes towards reconciliation. So a couple of years ago there was the lessons learned. There was a commission that was much like the Truth Commission in South Africa. There was a similar inquest in Sri Lanka, and there was a number of recommendations made around acknowledgement of war dead, around giving back particular sites, and that's something that's going to be very difficult for this government to do in a way that enables them to retain strong relations with all of the different communities in Sri Lanka. And I think one of the reasons, like you said, one of the reasons that this government was elected was because people were very conscious that they did not want to give power to President Rajapaksa again. And so it was very strategic voting, I think, was something that we saw. So yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's something that we'll probably both be following quite keenly. Okay.
Another question?
Oh, that charming face always has a question for me.
Yeah, it's good you're a advisor. Now, the question I have is really, to what extent can we talk in terms of dehumanization without foregrounding a particular conception of what it is to be human? And from your dictionary definition, it doesn't seem that oppression is incompatible with being human. So in your understanding, what is it to be human, which makes oppression dehumanizing?
I think the fundamental, one of the core things that it means to be human is to be able to live with dignity. And I think that core dignity that's been denied, particularly to ethno-religious minorities that I highlighted here, so the Rohingya, the Palestinians, and the Tamil communities in Sri Lanka, that dignity of daily life is something that is really, really core. And that's something that oppression denies. That's the problem with oppression. While people are still able to eat, they're still able to, on a very basic level, go to the toilet and, go to work. That's not enough to really exist and to be really a truly realized human being. And so I think that's why oppression it's just to refer to oppression as a dehumanizing process. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Okay. Thank you very much.